Hello, welcome to Making Revenue Tick. Delighted to be joined by Sean McCarry today, and we're going to get into some topics around managing sales managers and sales leadership. So if you haven't already been introduced to Sean, it would be brilliant if I give you the opportunity now. So Sean, could you tell us a bit about the roles you've carried throughout your career so far?
Richard, thank you for being here. I look forward to our conversation. Sean McCarry. I've been in IT software sales for nearly 30 years, starting with companies such as Dell and growing into the likes of Computacenter and helping grow that revenues. And then latterly got into the software companies such as Novell, Computer Associates, Adobe, as well as a few startups on the way. So 30 years experience in a mix of infrastructure, application, media, and other technologies. So it gives me, including fintech, which gives me a wide breadth of experience across the IT industry.
Fantastic. And then within your 30-year career, what sort of roles have you had within different organizations?
Obviously, like everybody else, I started off carrying the bag. So everything from account management, following my career to the account director, global account director roles, and then fairly quickly into sales management, sales directorship roles, even managing director roles, and regional general management roles, with the last role being head of the Logitech business, which was a business driven by video conferencing, which was with growth from 150 million to over 600 million within 2 years. So some big numbers, but also in some small startups where the numbers are a lot less, and it's more about account acquisition strategies. So again, a nice wide breadth of roles, but mostly for the last 20 years, it's either been second level and third level sales management roles, including general management.
Yeah, brilliant. So on top of being very deep, it's very salient in terms of the topic that we're going to be talking about today. So how this all came about is that we asked Sean to come onto the main podcast that we do called What Makes You Tick, and he told his career story. And we had a couple of follow-up conversations afterwards and just really connected around some of the fundamental ideas that are really important in the market right now. And a few of those things were sales management behavior, emotional intelligence and EQ within sales, team health and well-being, and building a positive sales culture. And so we were talking around these topics, and I said, look, Sean, if we could speak about this in a bit more detail on making revenue tick, I think that would be something that people would get a lot of value from. So with your permission, Sean, what I'll do is ask you a few questions and we can have a chat around those different areas and see what pearls of wisdom from your 30-year career we can impart on our listeners.
I look forward to the questions. Fire away.
Okay. Amazing. So sales management behavior, when I asked you what you would like to cover as topics, that was the number one thing that you said. So I guess the obvious question would be, what is it about sales management behavior that makes it such a big, important topic for a senior revenue leader like yourself?
Sales management it's a critical area that if you want an organization to succeed at the higher level or hit those strategic goals, which very often have that revenue growth number associated, you really need sales management to be able to be supportive. We've used the word trust many times. You used the word emotional intelligence, which is a hot topic for me, and we will go into that in deeper. But the sales team and the individuals of a sales organization have to be supported. You talked about, well-being. And again, we'll go into that later on. But I look for a sales manager has to have emotional intelligence to be able to succeed, because their job is to support the individual sales, driving the number and actually, driving deals with either end customers or partners. So the emotional intelligence of sales leadership is critical. You expect people to have different leadership styles, but the big thing about emotional intelligence is about yourself. There's key points. You've got to be self-aware. If you're not self-aware, you don't know or won't understand what you're doing, which affects people, which leads to self-regulation. Self-regulation is if I'm doing something that's affecting someone negatively, I need to be self-aware to change my own behavior. One thing that people skip on, motivation. Does that person want to be a sales manager? Great salespeople very often get promoted into that sales management role, and some of them don't want to do it. So is the motivation there? And this then leads to the motivation of the sales individuals, the smart goals those sales leaders give. And we touch on it. It's very similar. And again, emotional intelligence is going to be me repeating myself over and over again. But when you look at empathy, when you look at social skills, now those are the key ingredients of emotional intelligence as an individual. If you don't have empathy to relate to someone in your team, how are you going to support them? How are you going to build a relationship? And the last one, social skills. Successful teams normally are a positive environment, a motivated environment. And therefore you do need to have the social skills, which empathy is part of, to build those relationships and to really help support, coach, and drive that sales behavior. So that's where sales management needs that emotional intelligence with all those ingredients I've just spoken about to allow those sales managers to individually support, motivate, and drive revenue growth with the sales teams. And that's why, to me, it's critical, because if that breaks, you're going to have a failing sales team. So I think that's the answer, hopefully, to your first question.
Well, absolutely. And the data, like if you look at the latest data from RepView, I believe that in the last quarter, only 41% of enterprise sales teams were on target. Wow. So the majority of the market's failing for various reasons. And I think it's one of the least spoken about topics in terms of, well, what can sales managers do about it? Because there's lots of these global problems that we're being presented with. The market's tough and, valuations are down. All these things are true. People are more skeptical. Buying decisions are more complicated. All those things are true, but sales management kind of hasn't come to the forefront in terms of what people can do differently in terms of their leadership and the way that they work with people to get the most from them. And also in this market, because there's been so many layoffs and there's so much uncertainty, I believe, and what we hear all the time, is that there's a huge amount of skepticism, pessimism, and caution from talent in terms of picking the right organization to go and work with, because they've all had bad experiences of not great sales management that's meant that they've not been as successful as possible. So I think that organizations that can display that they've got really strong sales managers in place will attract the best talent and then win. What do you think about that?
The first thing I'm going to say about that is sometimes it's not the sales managers that sets the let's say targets or the revenue goals. Sometimes that flows down the organization. Sure. And I still see it as total failure of leadership when you have an organization where 40, 50, 60% of individuals, and I do know of cases of 100% of individuals in an organization are not anywhere near hitting their targets. And when I see that, it drives to huge negativity in the sales team. And if an organization thinks a sales individual is going to be loyal when they're there and they've been given a target which is unachievable, poor leadership. But they also, it also drives it shows a lack of loyalty both ways. And I like to actually, this is a really important topic. Organizations have always expected loyalty from individuals. Likewise, I believe an individual has the right to expect loyalty from the company because they're going to give their heart and soul to that company to be a motivated, successful sales individual. And I think we're in a world at the moment where loyalty doesn't exist in a lot of companies and therefore in a lot of individuals. We've gone a long time ago. I think we've gone from, it's very rare that people stay in an organization for a very long time.
Sure.
And when you see that, I think it's a pat on the back for that organization because they're obviously doing something right. But I do think it's a challenge. I think it's a very difficult role as a sales leader, whether it's second line or even third line management, to give out revenue targets which are unachievable. It goes back to SMART goals. We've talked about SMART goals time and time again when people always ask me about objectives. Well, if they're not attainable or achievable, whatever you want to say, it's not a relevant goal. And therefore it's going to drive bad motivation. Talent acquisition will disappear because the market will pick up. And when the market gets strong, the more talented individuals probably already thinking about what's my next move and talking to people like yourself. So and that comes through, again, going about that, self-awareness and being able to understand that if I'm going to give someone an objective which is unachievable or highly unlikely to be achieved, I can't see how that person's going to be motivated or will go the extra mile. And I've seen it in all organizations, even very recently, where you've had high-performing, really hard-working individuals become uninterested, not hardworking, and accepting that they're going to hit 50% of their target, and therefore they'll make 50% of the effort. And I think organizations have to wake up to that because at the end of the day, everybody wants to hit a number and achieve and be successful for the company. Because, when you join a company, you want to believe in that organization, otherwise you won't be able to sell the technologies, and you want to drive that business forward. And therefore, I think, again, it's not just target setting, it's objective setting, it's how you manage people, building relationships, having empathy to understand if I'm setting an unachievable objective, which you've touched on with 40% not hitting targets, what's the emotional effect on that individual? How can that person be highly successful or highly efficient if they're not motivated to do the role through poor leadership?
Sure. Makes perfect sense. So I think there's probably going to be three groups of people watching this. I might be wrong. Let me know if I am. But there will be...
Is that three people or three groups?
We can aim high. So I think there'll be probably three groups just based on the nature of our networks, right? So you'll probably have some owners of businesses and C-level people who are looking at getting more from their sales management team and making that a really effective team to grow the business. You'll have some sales leaders who are in business right now who are looking for ideas around how they can do their job more effectively and manage their direct reports more effectively. And you'll have some people in transition who are looking for that next role, who want to make the right decision about which organization they go into. So I guess if we kind of break that into the two major groups, people who would be hiring sales managers and sales managers themselves. If we talk about targets being a big problem, and it is, right? 41% of sales teams hitting target is a massive, massive problem with huge downstream ramifications for everyone. Let's say you're a founder or you're on that top level of the board and you are responsible for setting the revenue goals and the investor expectations and ultimately the targets, what are some of the things that they can do to make sure the targets that are being set are realistic, attainable, and therefore will be motivating and create a healthy team environment?
I think it's a very difficult discussion because, founders, investors are looking at, the best return on investment.
Sure.
It's business. So I totally understand that. But I also think there's got to be an alignment of expectation. If the expectation of founders, investors is unrealistic, it's not good for the investor or the founder, as well as it's not good for the company when you fail to hit that number. I'm not against very challenging revenue targets. I'm not against high objectives. But again, you've got to be explained to be motivational for the organization to drive that forward. And we are trying to talk about growth environments here. I touched on my background. It's far more enjoyable working in a environment where you can succeed and you can see the development of either whether it's the product, the solution, but also the high customer satisfaction from the customer base. All those things lead to motivation and a positive environment. So it's a really hard balancing act, and it is a balancing act. I think organizations may have to look at the longer term rather than the shorter term. We have been through a very traumatic few years. Some IT organizations in the pandemic saw super growth, so especially some of the large global hardware. But should that expectation be to continue with the 100, 200% growth the following year and the next year? And I think that's, people are hiring with that expectation. And I think that's where we've had a bit of a rebalancing, which has been hard on everyone, I believe. But again, your question, I don't think there's any right or wrong answer. And in sales and in this environment that we all work in, there's never one answer to one problem or one challenge. But I do believe there's got to be expectation setting. Many a time in my career, I've been told it's one thing to, lose a number, but it's not acceptable to forecast inaccurately.
Sure.
And that's really key. Because going back to that, a business makes investment decisions on the expected revenues in the future. And that's why, in the software world, forecasting is so incredibly important and so much emphasis is put on that. So again, going to your original question, it's very difficult for a leadership team in a company to meet expectations of founders, investors, etc., and at the same time balance and have a motivated sales team. And that's an ongoing challenge. And that's where I believe going back to that first line sales management is so critical, where they understand the challenges individuals are having. Whether you said 40% a few times. Okay, well, if 40% are failing, that means 6 out of 10 are hitting the number. Can there be a balance in all that number somehow? I don't know. It's a challenge, but it's one that I think emotional intelligence, understanding how your individuals are reacting, behaving, what coaching they need. But it also now touches on leadership styles. And I think it was one of your future questions that we were going to discuss. And again, leadership styles is, we've touched on emotional intelligence, but a leader has to have multiple leadership styles.
Sure.
Because sometimes you have to do, this is what we're doing. You might not like it, but we're doing it because we have to do it. And it is a leadership style that sometimes has to happen. It's the end of a quarter. We have to do the deal. So get on with it. You might not like asking the question, the customer, but we've got to do it. But then you got other people who the democratic style, where the great thing about democratic style, most people can be really happy and bought into the outcome that you all agree on. The problem with it might take ages to get to that point. And although you've got the whole team on board with this democratic, great leadership style, sometimes you'll see that it takes too long.
Sure.
And that's where, I would expect a good sales manager or even sales leader perhaps to have multiple leadership styles because the team will need different things. And by the way, everybody has a preference. My go-to leadership style or sales styles will always be coaching. It'll always be that supportive, let me help you get to your number, let me help you, what's the problem, and give that coaching. I think it's my go-to. But that's why I've got to be self-aware. And we talked about emotional intelligence. I've got to be self-aware that no, this isn't coaching now. This is a coercive, direct leadership style, or whatever else, pace setting style, whatever it is.
Yeah.
So I think it's interesting. Leadership style is based on emotional intelligence, but it's also the way you get the most from your individuals, because whatever we're doing, we're coaching, supporting, and helping those individuals, with the challenges they've got. And that also then goes on to, you mentioned earlier on, health and well-being. Mm. Well, if you don't have any empathy, how can you know if someone in your team is, I don't know, having problems outside of work, stress that, maybe you just need to say to them, look, once a day, switch your phone off and go for a walk. And I've done that many times in my career. And I don't think there's anything wrong with doing that, because when that person comes back from that 1 hour off, they're then ready to go, they're motivated, and they've got, a clear path to action. So it's all interwoven. Leadership styles are important because your team needs that from you, and they need that support. And it is coming back to this support. A unsupportive, unachieving sales team is never going to be highly motivated. It doesn't work. The most motivated sales teams you'll get are the teams that are successful in achieving, because that drives motivation, and that also supports well-being. Because the problem with the negativity, it's negative everywhere.
Sure.
And that's across the organization. This isn't just sales now, because if sales are failing, the product team are probably failing. The marketing teams are failing. You then have the, people and culture challenges. So, sales, I believe, leads an organization and drives that behavior. And it needs sometimes the organization to get behind that.
Yeah.
So
100%. So if we talk on the topic of sales management behaviour then, and you touched on it a bit, but it'd be good to summarise. What are some of the common mistakes and pitfalls that you see sales managers making when it comes to their behaviour and leadership styles?
I would say probably the number one is when a sales manager, leader, always thinks it's their way and it's only their way, because I mentioned earlier on, I think there's always at least 2-3 ways of, achieving success. And it takes different personalities, different approaches. But I don't believe there's always just one way to do things. And you might have the best sales guy or girl who's been promoted into that sales leadership role, and they always just take that pace setting leadership style. And a pace setting leadership style, just to let you know, is watch me do it. I'm going to go in, step aside, and I'm going to do it all, and everyone follows me. And do you know what? Sometimes that's great. But if that's your only leadership style, it might be great the first time, the second time, but how are you ever going to, you'll never trust that salesperson, because every time that sales manager gets involved, they'll push that salesperson to one side. And I'm sure you could talk to every salesperson, and they've had a manager that every time got introduced to a customer, didn't take a supportive role, took, I'm here to do the deal role.
Sure.
And that's that pace setting scenario where, going back to your question, it's that multiple leadership roles. And I'm sorry that I'm repeating myself. But what do I see as the most mistakes? It's someone with a one style, one approach, and there's no flexibility there. And that doesn't mean they're a bad person. It doesn't mean that they don't want to help or support that individual. They just don't have the self-awareness to understand what is the effects of the actions they're making.
Yeah, makes sense. You touched on a few different leadership styles here, and I know that on top of having a 30-year career in tech sales, you've gone on to study all of this stuff in a much higher level of detail. Could you just summarize? You talked about, democratic, you talked about supportive, coaching, autocratic. What are the various leadership styles?
I'm quoted mostly from a old article, and there's several versions, but this was from the Harvard Business Review when I was lucky enough to be sponsored into a program for leadership development, which is an executive program that a previous organization supported me on. And that was, they very much drive case studies, business case studies. And, you look at Coca-Cola versus Pepsi, you look at Kodak, you look at Southwest Airlines, and you look at all these multiple organizations and how leaders drove those organizations either to success or to failure. And what's interesting is that's where I think I learned there's not always the one answer to any one problem. There's multiple. Sure. But during that time, there was a massive focus on emotional intelligence. And I think it's been a hot topic for 15 plus years. But I still see a lack of it so often. And I don't know whether it was seen as a fad or just seen as not a management style, but just a more of a people and culture thing. I don't know. But I do strongly believe that if you want to be a successful sales leader and help people on a journey, motivate people, and drive high growth sales, which I've been lucky enough to be involved in multiple times, you do need that skill set. Because I only said it once on this, but I remember talking to you previously, Richard. Trust. It's huge. I think, me personally, if I don't trust an individual, how can you delegate anything to an individual? And you are talking about, business critical activities. You're talking about, how an entire business can, achieve their strategic goals or the revenue expectations. And if you can't delegate, you can't scale. And therefore it goes, and this is where trust, but it also goes the other way, which I said earlier on about loyalty. But if you're starting to give goals to someone which aren't, they're not smart goals because they're not, achievable, or they're not time bound, or whatever it is, I think those people quickly lose trust in you. And you see it in organizations. It's not just a sales manager losing trust in a sales individual. You can have sales individuals lose trust in a sales manager. And that's a difficult problem then, because that can then grow. Because if one sales individual has a lack of trust in their sales leader, you'll very often find it won't be just one sales individual, it'll be multiple sales individuals. And again, it's something that happens, going back to maybe a self-awareness or lack of self-awareness of the results of people's actions.
Yeah, fascinating. You talked a lot about this, emotional intelligence, empathy, and you talked about how it's so important for businesses to get this right, because ultimately you are working with people and sales is the engine for the whole business. When you're hiring sales managers, how do you know, and what are the clues that you're looking for that they would have the right level of emotional intelligence and empathy to be effective leaders?
It's a balancing act, isn't it? Because I think one thing is, I think people look at experience maybe a little too much, because someone might, and you're more of an expert on people employment and talent acquisition than myself, but when you look at a CV, let's say, and it looks at someone's experience, and very often AI even does it for organizations nowadays, which is, to me, sometimes a challenge. But if that CV says, oh yeah, I've done 5 years sales management here, 7 years sales management there, does that mean automatically that that person's a great sales manager? I don't believe it does. It says they've got the experience, which is a tick, a big tick. But I look at likability hugely. When I'm sitting across the table or on a Zoom call or a Teams call, whatever it is, over the last few years, interviewing people for roles, likability is a big part of that. And I believe that's in sales. At the end of the day, I'm sales through and through, and I've had a lot of experience in that. I still believe you do have to have the right product. You do have to have the right solution. You do have to have the right organization behind you that is respectable, sustainable, etc. And I also think people buy it from people they trust and like. And again, when you're employing or hiring people, to me, likability is incredibly important, as well as experience. You can't, I wouldn't hire someone because I think they're a really, really nice person, but they don't have any experience. But I might take a chance on someone who hasn't been a sales manager before, but been a successful salesperson, and they want to make the step into sales leadership, and they demonstrate that emotional intelligence as well as likability. I'm very happy to look at that person and take a chance. And I don't think it's that much of a chance either, by the way, because it goes back to the motivation. Does someone want to be there, or don't they?
Yeah.
And you can be the most skillful person there is. But if they don't want to be there, we haven't touched it. Work ethic. to me, it's absolutely, I think it's driven into people, but, work ethic it's so, so important to me. And how can someone have a really great work ethic if they're not motivated, the company's not being loyal, etc.
Yeah.
So I think it all comes into that behaviour as well.
Yeah, makes sense. And it's an interesting one. It's emotional intelligence, right? So do you think that someone can become more emotionally intelligent? Is it a skill or is it innate?
I think it's a bit of both. I think there are individuals who will always be the individual, you will do it my way, and that's the end of it. And some of those people have had great careers, by the way. But you will probably talk to people in their sales teams over the years where some people will think that person's the best sales leader and others probably don't. I think it's something that definitely can be learnt. I really do. Because all you have to do is be that self-aware and think about it. Most people in sales are quite sociable. Most people in sales probably have empathy. So they've got most of the skill sets. What they've also got to do is just be, okay, what if I do this? What's the actions and how does that person feel? And therefore have the self-regulation to change their own behavior.
Okay.
So definitely can be taught. Someone can be totally aware about emotional intelligence and different leadership styles. They've just got to think about it and take that time to think about it. And that's where the challenge probably comes.
Interesting. So do you think that when you're speaking to a sales management candidate to bring into your organization, is examples where they've self-reflected and adapted one of the major clues that you're looking for? So, I have noticed this thing about myself and changed it. If they're using that sort of language, would that be a big green flag?
And it's the most rewarding feedback you ever get. It's happened to me multiple times. I can picture individuals now when you say that to me, where those individuals needed someone to trust. They needed someone to understand their own emotional state, and then also have the honesty and transparency to tell them. Because again, this goes into leadership, is if someone's doing something wrong, you've got to inform that person what they're doing wrong. Now, some people will learn from it, some people won't. But the people who learn from it actually become far better sales leaders, and the trust and the bond you have between yourself and that individual becomes sometimes a friendship for life. Because you've got such a high level of trust that they know they can say anything to you. And likewise, and what I used to do quite a lot is, and this is time consuming, so it's difficult, depending on how many direct reports an individual has. But I used to like setting up one-to-ones with all my sales leader direct reports. And that one-to-one was for 30 minutes once a week. And we never talked about customers. We never talked about revenue. We talked about them. A bit like tick talent. What makes you tick? Basically on a one-to-one. What's happening in that person's life? Because unless you know where their state of mind is or what their challenges are, how can you support that individual? And therefore, if someone asks me, what should I do? As let's say, a first-line sales manager or even a second-line sales manager, what do you think is the best approach? I'd say, you should have a one-to-one with either the individual, try on a weekly basis. It could be monthly basis. The business drivers dictate this, but a 30-minute one-to-one, you can get so much out of it, and you can find out, maybe why that person is having a challenge or is frustrated, is achieving or isn't achieving. Because you then find out more about that individual, you find out what makes them tick, and you build that trust. And I do think that's a real key element that I think it's too easy to go, we're all too busy, I don't have time for one-to-ones.
Yeah.
One last thing on that one. When I set them, or you set them as well in the previous companies, it was that individual's choice to cancel that if he's too busy.
Okay.
So, and I never minded. So I wouldn't mind if they cancelled it 3 times in a row, but I wouldn't mind because it gives that meeting is their meeting. I'm just coming to listen and to learn. And therefore, if they're too busy that week, I don't want to apply even more stress onto someone by saying you have to take time to do this. So it's important that they're allowed to say, do you know what, Sean? I'm fine. Let's not catch up this week.
Sure.
That's absolutely fine.
Yeah, sure. I like the way you're giving them the safety to do that. I've been on both sides of that. I remember, probably, 5 years into my sales leadership career, reaching particularly busy times. We had our weekly one-to-ones where we would go through, and it was very much relationship building and helping out with problems. And I would cancel some of those because I got too busy. And I remember the damage that felt that it caused in terms of the level of importance that you showed that you had, that person had over the maybe revenue problem that you had or customer problem that you had. So I think the way you've positioned that you're allowing them to alleviate pressure is good. But then also the feeling of
it's not easy. It's not easy,
Yeah, exactly. I think it's the worst, just as maybe a warning sign for people that if you do commit to someone that you can do it weekly, you have to be able to do it weekly. It should never come. You should never cancel that meeting. So make sure it's something that you can honour. Really good, really good. So the other thing we wanted to talk about was team health and well-being, which I think is a massively salient topic for right now. And I know these are your words, team health and well-being. So what does team health and well-being mean to you?
I think it's about building that relationship. You need to understand how people behave, and you need them to build trust with yourself, to be open, honest, and sometimes transparent. It's very difficult for someone to come in and have a meeting and say, I need a few days off because, I'm overly stretched. It could be, I need to take the kids to school, for the next week, and the pressure on that individual without sharing that information can be a negative environment. So I think it's about knowing your team at an individual level, because then you can spot when people start changing their behaviour. And having that openness where you're happy to approach that person and say, do we need a conversation? I'm not saying I'm an expert in health and well-being at all. We have people and culture divisions in every organisation to really provide that support. But we as sales leaders should encourage them to make sure that they do use that support. But how would I? And this is just my approach. Is how would I know if someone is starting to struggle if I don't know that individual to see their behavior change?
Sure.
And if you see motivation change, someone's behavior change, ask the question. Some people want to talk about it, some people don't. And you've got to respect that. And that goes to everything that we've discussed, by the way. and maybe we don't say it enough, is you've got to respect every individual in the organisation. I think the large corporate, it's written into the statement. I think building that trust, to be boring and repeat myself, understand the individuals, build relationships with the individuals, because internal relationships are incredibly important when we're all working together, and ensure that if someone is having those challenges, it's not about the number. Sometimes the person's got to come first, which is, again, in some organisations probably, and sadly, a hard statement to make. But I do believe that we are. You mentioned it earlier. We are in a people first environment. I've said it many times. My sales style is people first, and I believe that. And that touches on health and well-being. And if someone needs to take a few days off for whatever reasons, I personally would always support them on that, and I hope most organisations would. I think we all talk about health and well-being. I think the challenges everyone's been through over the last few years and continues to go through in the world we live in. I think organisations try and do support individuals, maybe sales managers and sales leaders, if they have responsibility to spot and try and support people wherever possible as well.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? I can think of some examples where I've had phenomenal leaders who have spotted my behaviour change before I'd even clocked it.
Yeah.
And you're like, oh my gosh, the level of emotional intelligence and empathy and intuition is so high that they've spotted you're under a bit of a cloud, and they've offered that, chance and safety for you to voice that. And it completely changes the way that you feel. And then the other side is, a lot of the time, I've experienced the other side with very, very low emotional intelligence leadership, where you're carrying around something very obvious to you, it's very palpable, and they don't spot it at all.
Yeah.
And unless you specifically called it out with them, they would never have a clue, because they're just not looking for those things. So I guess a question would be, you have people listening to this at various levels of that intuition and natural emotional intelligence. What are some of those early signs of stress and burnout that you think sales managers can look out for that will help them to get on top of issues while they're still baby frogs?
I think the most obvious one is when someone changes from being a supportive coaching manager to frustration, to anger, I think frustration is probably the number one that you see. Now, they could be frustrated in the organisation. They could be frustrated in the targets we've talked about, or they could be frustrated because something outside of work is happening.
Sure.
And you can tell that. And again, sometimes it doesn't take a lot to diffuse that frustration. I think we mentioned earlier on, it could be switch your phone off and go for a walk.
Sure.
Or even just go home early for a few hours.
Sure.
And something as simple as that can really just help in that situation. I'm not, there's individuals who obviously have far greater challenges and need a lot more support. But sometimes it's the smallest of things which can be resolved very quickly to support that person. And so me looking for it, it would be changes in behaviour, but it's normally more of frustration, or normally a fairly outgoing vocal person stops contributing.
Sure.
And that could be a result. And, the reality is, I think the summary there is, if someone's behaviour changes, ask the question.
Yeah. Can you think of a specific example, either a leader you've had with you or you with someone in your team, where spotting through emotional intelligence an issue to do with their health and well-being early had a really positive effect?
Yeah, I can think of a few. I can think of a few with myself when I've got frustrated, on the number, and the sales management or sales leadership team would have committed to a number. And what used to has frustrated me in the past is if someone then has no empathy or doesn't care.
Mm.
So they've made a commitment that they're going to do X, and then don't do it. And sometimes my frustration is there's no care there. And to me, I know that's happening, and I really have to bite my lip and explain to that person. And I can visualize individuals why it's important that you do X if you say you're going to do X. Because when you have multiple regional leads across a larger area, if everybody misses X, that's not 10% in one region, that's also 10% in the entire region, and that becomes a challenge. So again, we haven't touched it. We've touched about objectives slightly, but I think being transparent, but holding people to account. You can't hold people to account if they don't know what they're accountable for. And this goes, again, being clear, transparent, and saying, this is why you doing A, B, or C is so important. And if you're not going to do it, tell me you're not going to do it, compared with just not doing it. So that's one of my frustrations. But I also know where people have come into me and I'm being, argumentative or frustrated because I hadn't been clear in what my expectations were as well. And you learn these things.
Sure.
And I think it's quite, it probably happens to everybody at least once a week in every sales management role.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, it's a tough gig, right? When you were talking about, kind of doing what you say, it reminded me very much of your excellent friend, Jeremy Keefe, my old favourite client.
Yeah.
Just talking about that was like part of the way that he was brought up. You do what you say you're going to do. And that kind of like old school ethics and principles part, I think is so important, because if you don't have leaders that are holding people accountable to the expectations that they set, and they don't know the consequence that has throughout the business, very quickly that will bleed through your organization and discipline.
My commitments are based on their commitments.
100%.
So then all of a sudden I'm going to who my reporting line and failing to deliver. So I think it's an interesting topic. I think sales leadership is about being able to do multiple leadership styles. I've always said emotional intelligence is very important in that. I think we touched on that quite well. But sometimes we have to do what we don't want to do and just get on with it.
Sure.
And that's part of sales leadership as well.
Yeah, sure. Okay, perfect. So last point to touch on is about building a positive sales culture. So let's end on a high. So we've talked about a lot of the problems and the challenges and just the darn right hardness of sales leadership in the modern world of tech. If we talk about sales culture, obviously no one wants a negative sales culture.
No.
But the reality is they might be in one right now, or they might have just come from one right now. If I talk about what a positive culture looks like, what does a positive culture look like to you?
High levels of communication, transparency, so everybody understands what the goals are. And when I say goals, I mean the company strategies.
Sure.
I think the strategy at the top level is quoted as a strategy, and how the objectives tie into that strategy sometimes aren't explained. So the middle management might understand that, but then the actual individual contributors might look at it and go, I don't care, I'm doing my number.
Sure.
I'm motivated, I'm happy, I'm great. And therefore you've got this miscommunication. So what is a positive motivated environment? High levels of motivation, high levels of trust, transparency on what we're trying to achieve, fair reward, so people believe in, there's benefit. And the last one is trust. It always goes back to trust. Either the sales leader trusting the individual contributor, or the individual contributor trusting the sales leader, or anywhere else in an organization, whether it's, as you say, marketing, product management, people and culture, finance, sales operations, etc. That trust across the organization is absolutely critical for that positive environment.
Yeah, absolutely. And then could you describe an initiative or maybe a system that you've implemented that's really helped to transform the sales culture and in turn the results that they've achieved?
Cross communication.
Okay.
With people in different departments. It amazes me still when you go to a new organization or some large organizations where the sales team don't know marketing, or they don't know the talent team, or they don't know sales operations or the finance, or they don't bother. I think I used to, in several previous organizations, once a month, get the leaders of the different divisions to go out together or get their teams to bond, so people would know who to go to, but then they'd also understand why finance are asking this question from sales. But likewise, finance would then also understand the challenges asking that from sales. So to me, cross communication across all divisions in an organization is a positive strategy, full stop.
Yeah, amazing. And in a world where silos are so easily created and so destructive, it's such an obvious thing to do.
And sometimes internally, competition is internally encouraged.
Sure.
And so, I think that's an easy one. Yeah, the strategy should be, make sure we, several people I know very well, they come up with the strap phase, and it's on emails, it's everywhere, but it is so important. It's, we work as one.
Sure.
One team mentality. And it doesn't matter whether you're in sales, marketing, HR, people and culture, finance, whatever it is. At the end of the day, it's one company.
Yeah, absolutely.
So that's important.
100%. Well, look, Sean, thank you so much for your time. I think you've imparted a load of great knowledge and ideas here. So I really hope people have enjoyed listening to this episode. If you would like to ask Sean any questions, I'll put his links to his contact information below. Otherwise, thank you so much. And we look forward to seeing you on the next episode. Thank you so much.
Richard, thank you very much again. Bye.
Cheers. See you soon.